Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Priscilla. I'm a curator from the museum. So thank you once again for joining us in this talk tonight. This is actually part of the museum's Historia SG series, which offers insights on Singapore's culture, history and heritage. And the talk tonight is the first for 2019. So 1 week ago today, 77 years back, Singapore fell to the Japanese, and with it began one of the darkest chapters in the history of modern Singapore. The local population suffered during the 3.5 years of Japanese occupation, living in fear, hunger, and in poor conditions. During this period, hundreds of women in Singapore, mainly Korean, but also Chinese, Indonesian, and Malay, were forced into sexual slavery by the Japanese military. These women, together with tens, if not hundreds of thousands of other women, became known as comfort women, and they served in comfort stations in the territories occupied by the Imperial Japanese Army in Asia during World War II. In Singapore, comfort stations were found across the island, including buildings still standing in Cane Hill Road, Jalan Jurong Kechil, Tanjung Katong Road, and Teo Hong Road in Chinatown. Now this evening, we are very honoured to have with us Professor Kevin Blackburn to give us a lecture on the comfort women of Singapore during the Japanese occupation, a dark heritage trail. Prof. Blackburn will be speaking about the topic of comfort women in Singapore in both history and memory, and to look into what has become known as dark heritage sites of human suffering. Now, Kevin, of course, is a dear friend of the museum who has sat on a number of our advisory panels, and the curators have all benefited from his generosity, as he's always so forthcoming in sharing his knowledge. Kevin Blackburn is an associate professor in history at the National Institute of Education, Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. He has taught in Singapore since 1993, when he left the history department of the University of Queensland to take up his present teaching position. He teaches and researches the history and memory of the Japanese occupation of Southeast Asia. And on the topic of war and commemoration, he has co-authored with Carl Heck That Singapore Have to Fall, as well as War Memory and the Making of Modern Malaysia and Singapore. He has also co-edited the book Forgotten Captives in Japanese-Occupied Asia. Before we invite Prof. Blackburn on stage for his talk, there's a few housekeeping matters. There will be a Q&A session after the lecture, so do keep your questions till the end. Also, kindly turn your smart devices to silent mode, and please be mindful of the sensitive nature of this topic. We look forward to a good and fruitful discussion about the topic this evening. And just in case you're worried about missing some the details or information about the talk tonight, don't worry, we'll actually be uploading a video of tonight's lecture on our website. That should be up sometime in March, so you can keep a lookout on the museum's website. So without further ado, Prof. Blackburn, please. Let's welcome him.
Okay, thank you very much, Priscilla. Thank you for coming. I'd just like to start off with why I'm giving this talk, actually. It has something to do with this book. In 2017, about 8 Korean historians emailed me and got in touch with me about their research trip to Singapore to collect documents on the comfort women. I gave them as much assistance as I could, and then I detailed the 7 sites of comfort stations in Singapore, and I said, well, you'll have to get someone to show you around. And after several months, they came back and said, well, we haven't found anyone. Can you do it for us? So I said, okay, I'll do it. And this is the first time I did it, and probably the first comfort women tour of Singapore. Okay, so I took them to all the sites possible, actually, not all 7, but as you'll see, as close as I could get. Okay, so they actually did pay me, actually, surprisingly. They had money for a guide, actually. So, there are Koreans around who will come to Singapore. As we see, there are also Japanese who will come to Singapore as well to see these aspects of dark heritage, as I say. Okay. Okay, so what is dark heritage? Okay, it's a common term that is cropping up. There's elements of it, 3 different elements if you want. You can have, like the London dungeons. You can have kind of dark heritage in entertainment. And then, of course, there's dark heritage like the Holocaust sites as well. And the last one is probably the place where we would put the comfort stations of Singapore, actually. They're somewhat known, actually. They're unmarked, and as we'll see, actually, in many cases, they're unwanted. Okay, so one could argue, is this heritage? But as I said, actually, I've conducted, a heritage trail for visiting Koreans, and I know that Japanese tourists that are aware of comfort sites do visit them as well. Okay. Okay, so the research work, okay. There's lots of research work on the comfort women. Comfort women of Singapore, not so much actually. The doyen of this, the man who's most responsible for this, is the man sitting in the middle. At one of the conferences that I did in 2005 on the Japanese occupation, I invited him. His name is Professor Hayashi. Okay, he's written extensively on the comfort women and the massacres of the Chinese as well. So, unfortunately, most of his detailed work, as you see, is in the Japanese language, okay? But there are English language sources that have used his work as well, okay? A lot of what I'll tell you tonight is actually drawn from his work in the 1990s and also his book in 2007, okay? So, if you're a Japanese language speaker, there is this rich source of material. Okay, so how did we get to the situation where we are now, where Korean historians are coming down wanting a comfort tour of Singapore, actually? Before 1991, the comfort women were scarcely known internationally, and in Singapore also. There was, basically, as we'll see, not much awareness of this aspect of Singapore's past. So in 1991, we have the Korean women coming to Japan to sue the Japanese government. Okay, that's the first time internationally we hear of the comfort women since basically the end of World War II. So in 1992, you have, once again, another historian who basically wants to tell the Japanese government that there's lots of evidence in the military archives of comfort women. Professor Yoshimi, who worked with Professor Hayashi, so he goes into the archives and within hours brings out all these documents that basically contradict what the Japanese government is saying in 1992. So the upshot of this is basically the Japanese government can't lie. So basically it issues the Kono statement whereby they acknowledge the existence of the comfort women and also that they were coerced as well, and also they give something of an apology. So what happened, you have 50 years of silence. This is Yoshimi's book translated into English, actually. Quite a very good book, actually, in terms of if you really want to know about the lives of the comfort women, which I won't cover too much here, across East Asia. This is an excellent book. It's been used as a textbook in many Japanese colleges. Of course, it's the English language version. So it is an excellent book if you're fascinated by this topic, actually. It's rich in detail and very good in terms of observations. He observes that these women were, brutally enslaved, by a patriarchal system, whereby, basically men went off to war and women served them through prostitution, basically sexual enslavement. And after the war, of course, these women went back into a patriarchal society. And we can see this in the early press reports about comfort women in Singapore, which I haven't included in this lecture. But a lot of it's, this image of them as the fallen woman. Basically, they've been taken from their homes, and they've been put into, kind of places of prostitution. And from this, basically, they've become the fallen woman, basically irredeemable, actually. So patriarchy, ensures that these women are largely silent. Certainly in the case of Singapore for a long time, but other countries as well, actually. So what happened in Singapore, actually? What happened in Singapore in 1991 to 92? Okay, we have this blockbuster of a documentary, the first documentary on Singapore TV about the Japanese occupation between empires. If you remember, it's full of lots of brutal things. In a sense, it's almost like Singapore TV, thought of, all the possible ways that they could portray the Japanese military in the worst possible light. Babies being bayoneted, women being raped. All these things that did happen, but of course, they used them to sensationalize. It became quite an amazing documentary series, two episodes. Okay, so in this we don't hear about comfort women because it was made just a bit earlier in 1991-92, before the issue broke. Actually, we hear about what's common when we talk about women's experience in Singapore, which is the fear of rape during the Japanese occupation. This is quite a common feature in oral history interviews. Okay, so we see testimony from 2 women, okay, on this. So after the comfort women becomes an issue, we see the first depiction of a Singapore woman as a comfort woman. And it's on the slide, obviously. It's our beloved Fiona Xie, actually. She's the first one to actually portray a comfort woman in this docudrama. It's more a drama than a documentary. So, yeah, it's 2001, a war diary. Most of you would have forgotten about it, of course. It ran for 20 episodes. Okay, so we were astonished, actually, when she was taken away and she put in a comfort station. And, we learnt that comfort women wear uniforms or wore uniforms. And this is something many people didn't know, but it's true, actually. They've got the colour wrong, actually. The women tended to wear white, actually. Of course, not all did, but usually you could tell a comfort station because the women there were wearing white nurses-type uniforms. Why this happened, I don't know, as we see, but it's one of the distinguishing characteristics of a comfort station. Okay, even in other places outside of Southeast Asia. So in popular culture, we have a few representations of comfort women. These are the plays that have been about comfort women. The one by Kapao Kun, actually, it's a comfort woman, but it's obvious that it's a Korean comfort woman. The other 2 are plays by Wild Rice and also by the Malay theatre company as well, Theatre Kami. They're obviously about a local woman, most likely Singapore women, because they're about Malay women. The director for Theatre Kami actually was inspired by a Berita Harian article about comfort women. Okay, so now it's a feature of popular culture. But what was it in 1945, actually? It was there strong in the memory of people just after the war, actually. If you look at the newspapers and look at comfort girls, actually, as a category, or search for comfort houses, you'll discover that there's quite a bit on this, and comfort women are seen as almost like something that is not basically something that should be treated with sympathy. Actually, many accounts are not that sympathetic, but there are sympathetic accounts. So yeah, basically, it's kind of painting them as kind of victims of Japanese brutality. So here we see a Chinese cartoon compilation, which is lurid and full of lots of sexual images and violent images anyway. And then we see something more artistic by Lu Kang, which is also in Chinese originally. And he portrays a comfort house. Apparently in Malaysia, there was one comfort house that, occupied a chapel or a church, actually. So it's based on some kind of truth, actually. So, yeah, this is perhaps the most well-known image from Chop Suey. Okay, so documents at the time reflect that there is this concern that it did happen, particularly in Malaysia, actually. They used a lot of local women, particularly Chinese women, to basically fill their comfort stations. So we have this testimony, a piece of document from the Kuomintang branch in KL. Actually, I use it for my book, actually, which is why the Koreans contacted me. So basically they describe how a large number were taken from some of the wealthiest families in Kuala Lumpur, kind of like what Fiona Xie actually had when she was kidnapped from her Peranakan family. Okay, so yeah, this is a quote that I use for my book. And based on the work of Professor Hayashi, he did work on Malaysia, Malay Peninsula. These are all the known comfort stations in Malaya, actually. So it seems to be, there are actually even more. If you read some accounts like, Bahau, actually, the camp there, there's supposed to be, some comfort women there. So these are, basically all over. Only Terengganu escapes. And then Professor Hayashi in his article in Japanese says, it's likely that there are many more, actually. It's likely that there are many more comfort stations in, Peninsular Malaysia. So if there are that many in Peninsular Malaysia, and also Professor Hayashi says that there are 16 comfort stations in Kuala Lumpur alone. Okay, 16 alone. 16. Okay, so what about Singapore? These are the ones that he finds in his research of comfort women in Singapore. These are identifiable using Japanese documents and also oral history testimony, some of which we'll have a look at tonight. Okay, so you've got some of the more common ones. There are about 5 that were fairly well known and are in his 1994 article. Actually, there's 2 that aren't. Okay, so Cairn Hill Road is very well known as a comfort station. Actually, very well known. Okay. Tanjong Kotong Road, also well known, as a comfort station. The Bukit Paseo Road, the number 27, the Clan Association House, that's well known too. This one he didn't include in 1994 in his article in Jalan Jurong Kerchul around Beauty World around Bukit Timah Village. Okay, but he later discovered, through a document that he found from the archives, a Japanese military document, that they'd used that. There was a little map of the area, and basically from that map, these old shop houses from the 1930s could be possibly identified as the Comfort House. Okay, and also at Sentosa as well, you have buildings that were once behind Madame Tussauds or images of Singapore, which were a comfort house as well. We have corroboration of this through oral history testimony as well. Okay, and Pulau Bekum for the Navy, there's oral history account of that too. And lastly, Seletar Naval Base is where the airport is today, around there. Okay, there's Japanese military documents that indicate that place. So basically there are 7 known places, and Professor Hayashi documents these in his 2007 book, actually. So yeah, basically in 1994 he documents 5, and then after that he adds 2 more. So what were they like, actually? This is the classic kind of illustration of what a comfort house was like. Okay, so you have the women in white in cubicles, actually. This is the one in Shanghai, and this is an illustration, a painting, an illustration of the process of how they operated. Okay, so a classic determinant of what a comfort house is. Usually you have the presence of Korean women, usually you have the presence of women dressed in white, and usually you have a long line of Japanese privates and NCOs, not so many officers actually, waiting. Okay, so yeah, it's kind of mechanized sexual enslavement actually, because we'll look at something else which is kind of like something like what's called a restaurant. The Japanese set these up and had hostesses and had prostitutes, mainly from Japan, Japanese women, and these are called ryotei actually. That's a similar system, but not as mechanized as this one actually, in terms of very organized. Okay, so how did they adapt it to the buildings of Singapore and the sites? So this is in Cairn Hill, the most well-known one, actually. You can see that these are the shop houses in purple. They're preserved by the URA. They're not preserved because they're a comfort house, but they're preserved because these terrace houses are of aesthetic value, actually. So you'll notice, actually, behind, right at the top, actually, you'll notice that near the magnifying glass, there's a kind of odd-shaped building, and this building will become interesting. Okay, right. Okay. Oops. So yeah, it's this building here actually. It's all right. Okay, this building is. Today, a part of the art centre or whatever, it was once upon a time, after 1950, the Teachers Training College, which is a predecessor to my institution. Before then, the more older of you will know, it was actually ACS, a school. And it was a school during the Japanese occupation too. The Japanese kept the school, but they had the large comfort station right next to it, which makes for some interesting memories of some of the people who were at the school. Okay, but first of all, we start off with the person who may had the first memories after the international issue. Not surprisingly, it is Lee Kuan Yew, actually. So this is what he says when he's talking to the Japanese at a symposium in Kyoto, actually, early January. So it's very close to when the issue broke as international news. So he remembers the long lines. Remember, this is one of the characteristics of comfort stations, long lines. And he remembers also that it was at Cairn Hill Road, the one he was most familiar with. And interestingly, he actually says that at the time I didn't know they were Koreans. Okay, this is something too that interests people who basically want to look at the memory of it. And also he says something which is a bit shocking, actually, that he reckons that they saved the chastity of Singapore women. Well, as we'll see, they didn't actually. But, there is that argument that the Japanese military had, is that, as these comfort stations were built, it made the Japanese soldier more inclined to actually go to them rather than to rape, and as they'd done in China. Okay, so comfort stations kind of emerge out of this brutal system that the Japanese military sets up. Actually, this kind of innate violence that they cultivate amongst their men, basically spills over into sexual violence, and we see it at Nanking. Nanking was probably, there were comfort houses before Nanking, but Nanking was a catalyst for the building of more, actually. So, yeah, this is a classic militarist argument. Also, amongst the local culture, surprisingly, basically, I said there's silence, somewhat silence. There's this book that's quite nostalgic by Go Sin Tub, actually. He talks about this area. His comments are quite interesting too, actually. You'll notice that they're not really that sympathetic in terms of looking at victims, enslavement or whatever. He talks about mainly these waitresses, actually, that worked, in it. Supposedly they worked in a comfort station, or they might have worked in a restaurant, actually. The Japanese setting up of this restaurant with hostesses or whatever. His comments kind of confirm Lee Kuan Yew's, actually, when he says, he doesn't say it there, but he says it later on in the interview, that he believed also that Singapore women's chastity had been saved as well. So there's two men of the same generation who thank the comfort stations of Singapore for saving the chastity of Singapore women. Okay, so we'll move on to, this. Okay, this is to do with what's a comfort station and what's not. Okay. So you have the former principal of Singapore Chinese Girls' School, Tan Sok Kearn, actually. So she lived in Cairnhill Road, actually. She lived in number 57 and 59. They owned two houses. So her family was quite well off, because Cairnhill Road is like, I don't know, it's kind of like Cairnhill Road today, actually, or Cairnhill Road today. It's very wealthy, actually, a very wealthy place. So she remembers that, these are on the opposite side of the shop houses that were conserved, actually. So these houses her two houses have been demolished, actually, and now there's a condo there, actually. There's a condo there. So she says that also, well, her generation, not her in particular, but they say that, Singapore Chinese Girls' School at 37 Emerald Hill, they're trying to preserve it, was a comfort station. But actually, if you look at Shinozaki, the education officer and welfare officer, in his memoirs, he specifically says that actually, no, it was one of these horrible restaurants that, the Japanese military was setting up. So, but this is something where it's easy to mistake, one of these ryotei restaurants for a comfort station. Okay, so there's more testimony that comes about these places. So this is before 1991. So it's interesting, actually. People would refer to them as comfort houses, and the women who occupy them would be comfort girls. So it's there amongst that generation who knew about these places, because the Oral History Centre did this big project to gather all the memories of many people who lived through the Japanese occupation in the 80s. So this is a good source in terms of, was it common knowledge, actually. So it seems to be amongst many people who lived through the war. It wasn't common knowledge, but, some of them knew about it, particularly those who lived near them. Okay. So his impressions are quite interesting. He describes the long queue of Japanese soldiers or whatever, and women basically waiting in the comfort houses. The location's correct, actually. Okay, so looking at this is the school, Anglo-Chinese school, as it is. It's part of the Arts Centre today. Okay, so basically it's at the top, the very top. As you walk up past the terrace houses, you have to walk up a flight of stairs. So this is the school, interesting architecturally, basically. So what's down below is the old canteen, actually, down at the bottom near that no trespassing sign. Okay, so at the bottom is the old canteen, and also behind that is the row of shop houses that begins. So if you're at that school in the 1940s during the Japanese occupation, you've got a very good view of what's going on. So we see this in some of the students' testimony about this place. Okay, so these are young boys, actually. Okay, so basically the canteen was facing the backyard or back balcony of the comfort station. So the women would have one day of a week off, actually, where they'd have a medical examination. So these women would actually go out onto the kind of courtyard or balcony, which is right next to their canteen for the ACS school, And these boys would be, amazed by what was going on. So it's kind of like they're not really aware of the enslavement actually, but they're more aware of this. So basically, the principal, I'm not sure actually. I'm not sure if he was principal at that time, but maybe it's just a Japanese learning place. Okay, so basically, try and shoo everyone away from the canteen up to the other side of the school, which overlooks Scott's Road area actually. So often the boys just went up further into the top area of the school actually, and they had an even better view. Well, okay. So this is kind of boyhood memories of this area. So the other boys who were perhaps more adventurous actually, when it came, the Japanese were kind of focused on cleanliness or whatever, and prevention of venereal diseases as well. So they had condoms issued actually, and these were scattered after use. So, you had the principal's reaction to boys blowing them up, like balloons. And, he explained, classically, the dirt of the woman is on the outside and the dirt of the man is on the inside. So his memory of it is certainly not one of victimhood and enslavement. But, of course, it was there, actually. The oral history collection has no oral history interviews from comfort women, not surprisingly. We'll get onto that soon, actually. So what happens also is that they're not sure, actually. Like Lee Kuan Yew, they're not sure because they can't tell Koreans from Japanese. That may be shocking for Japanese and Koreans, but it happens, actually, in a sense. It's like even the historians who came down and they looked at this testimony, they were surprised, actually. And, how come they can't tell, Koreans from Japanese? But, at that time, the Koreans could speak very good Japanese. So even when they spoke to them, they spoke in Japanese. Okay, so more testimony will come later on. But basically, this question was raised in 1993, actually, after all the controversy, and Philippine women were also comfort women, Indonesian women. This was an inevitable question, actually. Were Singaporean women comfort women? And it was a difficult issue, actually, because there were none that were popping up, actually. No Singapore women were actually saying, well, I want compensation from the Japanese government. So it was debated amongst some historians because they said On Chit Chong was one who says there's no documented evidence, but actually all you had to do is look at a kind of modern version of this book from 1947. And it describes how Singapore women are coming back from Java. 15 of them are coming back from Java on the 6th of March. And the author of this book, N.I. Low, he basically meets them. And basically the classic question, you can see that, these women just don't have much faith in patriarchy because they say, will our fathers still have us? So, you can see that long silence and continue the silence amongst many women is more than justified, actually. Okay. So, yes, you see the journalist, he's very good, actually, at uncovering things. Pan Ming Yan, actually. So he's involved in uncovering, possible, comfort women's sites and also exploring this question. He does bring into this this article that basically people won't openly say, but some people will say their relatives were comfort women. Okay, so the next site is quite a large one, perhaps the largest. This one is hard. It's hard to actually say which building was a station and which was not. Accounts will give it in terms of somewhere between Wilkinson Road and Wareham Road, which is a long way actually. But if you look at a lot of these, these sites, actually, there are a lot of URA preserved buildings, pre-war shop houses along that side of the road, actually. So, when I took the Koreans down that road, I just stopped anywhere and said, well, it could be any one of these, terrace houses or shop houses, actually. We don't really know. And even Professor Hayashi as well, one source mentions the corner of Mountbatten Road and Hague Road, which is obviously demolished now, actually. But, between Wareham Road and Wilkinson Road, there are lots of accounts of that general location. So, we'll look at some of that testimony because it's quite interesting, actually. Okay, so this is not from the National Archives, but almost 1 year before the Comfort Women issue broke, actually, there was a book, written, it was a compilation of different experiences of the Japanese occupation. So we have here this one by someone quite familiar to us, one of the old guard of the PAP, Often Walk, and he talks about Tanjong Katong Road. And he talks about Indonesian women, in a sense that Japanese were moving Indonesian women, not just to Singapore. There were 3 batches, actually, if you look at some of the newspaper accounts, of Indonesian women coming through Singapore. Basically, there was about 219 who were, in those 3 batches, and about 50 stayed in Singapore, and then actually 20 returned, so that left about 30 who probably stayed and married local men, and Offenwok says that they did at the end of the war, and there is an account in the press at the time, actually, English language press, of this happening. The women don't want to go back. Once again, they say the same thing. Will our families have us if we go back? Also, they say that they like dancing and they like Singapore as well, so they stay. But yeah, the idea of being a fallen woman in a patriarchal society just is something that doesn't appeal. Okay. So another interview about this area, Robert Chong. This is 83. Remember, before the big controversy in 1991. This is from the National Archives too. You can easily search these online, actually. This is what I told the Koreans to do. Even when you go back to Seoul and Busan, I said you can still keep searching for this stuff. It's witnesses. It's not people who were comfort women, which is the big issue. Okay. So basically he describes how nondescript these places were. They really weren't anything like what we see in red light districts today, actually, in places like Amsterdam or other places, actually. So they were very quiet indeed. Okay, so what happens is that the women he describes too, interestingly, Offenwok describes them as appearing as nurses, and then he does as well. They wore these white uniforms, actually. Okay, so the description of the shop houses turned into comfort stations is quite interesting too. You had these long corridors, okay, that led to these cubicles where the women were. Of course, he couldn't go inside. He could just pass by. So he describes this. This is basically verbatim what he says, okay. So the Japanese would sit very quietly, and Robert Chong says, just like waiting to see the doctor, actually, very disciplined, very self-patient, very, very patient, okay. Okay, so the corridor, the crucial feature, of this long line is the corridor, actually. The shop houses had to be adapted to this purpose, and, elsewhere too, in China they did this as well. Other countries, they did it too. So usually, when the owners of the buildings came back, usually they'd find these, holes in their buildings where the Japanese had built these long corridors so the men could line up and queue orderly, okay. The idea was to bring, as I said, it's kind of like a mechanized or orderly system according to the people who designed it. Of course, it's, sexual enslavement. There's no doubt about that. Okay, so moving on to looking at the trail, actually, you see that this is perhaps one of the most well-known, actually. This is the one I described. It's at the junction of Bukit Paseo Road. It's number 27, Bukit Paseo Road, the junction between Bukit Paseo and Tiao Eng, just behind the Dorset Hotel, actually. Most people will be familiar with this site. Testimony suggests that Korean women mainly were in this place. Okay. So, yeah, this is more well-known, but, I won't bring up any testimony for this one. But this one was the one that was discovered in 1995. Quite interesting, this one. It has an interesting story behind it. Okay, so you can see it's near Beauty World, just up from Beauty World. This is an old map. So it's a row of shop houses. The one-story ones are the ones that Professor Hayashi positively identifies as a comfort station, and then the others, the double-story, he's not so sure about that. But as we'll see, the people around there who own the shop houses, a family, the Chong family, say that the whole area was a comfort station. You have a restaurant, the one story, and then you have the relaxation house or the comfort station. So this one is interesting because of a Singaporean whose history is attached to it. Okay, so Dr. Chong Pak Yan in 2000 submitted a dossier for preservation of his old family shop houses. His family had built them, and he thought he really loves this area, Bukit Timah village. So he documented their history, and of course he knew at that time that there were comfort houses, a comfort station, so he documented this too. So this probably makes this the first comfort house or station that was preserved because it was preserved for its history, its entire history. history, but a prominent part of the case he put up was that it was a comfort station for, and that's why that's one of the reasons why it should be conserved. Okay. So at the moment we have China, which, in its memory war of Japan, is increasingly trying to conserve its own comfort stations, and there are many in China actually. There's museums in old comfort stations. Okay, so in this case we have Dr. Chong, and he works, hand in hand with these two other people in the 1990s who are quite crucial to uncovering this history: the journalist from the Straits Times and also Professor Hayashi. So they find this document. Professor Hayashi finds it, gets in touch with the journalist, and the journalist gets in touch with Dr. Chong, who owns the shop house here, but of course has a history tied to the whole block. So Dr. Chong expresses his view. He reckons they are heritage, actually. He's very enthusiastic about this, and obviously he had to be because he had to put it up as a submission to the URA, which accepted it in 2002. So what he gets also from Professor Hayashi is this document. This document has a map on it that basically defines where the comfort house is actually. So it also has an operation manual for the comfort house actually. You'll see that the hours are there and which butai or military unit gets to use it on which day. The price, the Japanese soldiers, mainly privates and NCOs in this case, had to get a ticket, and they couldn't get in for their 30 minutes with the comfort woman without that ticket. Obviously very mechanized, very organized. Okay, so Wednesday was their only day off, actually. This is similar to Can Hill, actually. So, basically they had that one day where it's a medical day, okay, in terms of medical examinations. Okay, so, behind, the images of Singapore, or Madame Tussauds as we call it today, is also another comfort station that's been identified and basically written up as well. Okay. And as we go further out to sea, you see that Pulau Bukom was the comfort station. It's now, of course, massive oil refinery. Okay, so it was used by the Japanese Navy, and there were Malay villages on it, and they saw Indonesian women being used, in the comfort station. And the last one, there's Japanese documents, military documents that identify this. It's hard to know exactly where it is. Seletar Naval Base, it was a naval base the Japanese used it as a naval base. It's hard to know exactly where it is. It's in this general area, of course. It's been a naval base, an air base for a long time, and now it's an airport, actually. So Professor Hayashi gets Japanese documents that confirm this. Okay, so moving on to finally, what we started with was the Ryotei system, the restaurant system. Okay, so there were restaurants actually that the Japanese used for prostitution. Most of them were staffed by Japanese women. Most of the Japanese women were, kind of prostitutes, or they described them as geisha. They're, of course, not like the geisha that we see when we go to Kyoto and all these other places. At that time, there were geisha who were close to prostitutes, actually. So they tend to not be, what we imagine the geisha are. The geisha are certainly not prostitutes, certainly today. They just would describe some of the women working there as geisha. Sometimes, actually, the Japanese military would just describe them as typists. And actually, Shinozaki, who closed down one of these Ryotei, said that we kept all the real typists, and the ones that couldn't type, we sent them back to Japan, actually. Yeah. So the Singapore Cricket Club was one of these as well. That was closed down because it was so close to the mayor's office that local staff would start laughing when they could hear the drunken kind of cries of both the men and the women, just coming across from the cricket club. And the mayor didn't like this, and Shinozaki didn't like it, so they brought the commander Teriuchi down, from Saigon or whatever, and he could hear it, and he's closed it down very quickly. Others, of course, too. Shinozaki didn't like them, so he tended to close them down. This is one that he closed down. It became public knowledge, Nanhua Girls' School, Mount Sophia. What happened was that this was actually reported in the Allied propaganda news, and when that happened, immediately it was closed down, because the idea that, the Japanese military would turn a girls' school, into a place of prostitution was bad propaganda, so they shut it down eventually. Okay. So Shinosaki, in his memoirs, this is the Japanese language memoirs actually, he says this, on page 82. It doesn't appear in his English language memoirs. He says, regrettably, he never liked these places actually. So he says that, when the British get a colony, they build roads. When the French get a colony, they build a church. And the Spanish bring in a church, but they take out the gold and silver. But when the Japanese get a colony, they bring in these restaurants and a woman actually. So obviously there's something else. So in terms of, finishing up, close to finishing, the last known comfort woman, the last known woman to actually, say that she worked in Singapore was Kim Bok Dong, actually. She had passed away just after I wrote the abstract for this talk. She was born in 1926, and I wrote the abstract in December, and she passed away on the 20th. She had been ill for quite some time, but she was virtually a kind of national hero in Korea, actually. The president had visited her in hospital, and when she'd passed away, there was this mammoth 5-day period of mourning in Seoul. Okay. But interestingly, her path with Singapore crossed somewhat differently in 2013, in a sense that one of her wishes, she'd worked in Singapore, but also Malaysia, Indonesia, was actually to have a comfort woman statue in Singapore. So, of course, this would send shivers down the spine of any Ministry of Foreign Affairs official in Singapore, of course, given that whenever one of these pops up, you have a divisive issue between the Japanese community and the Korean community. In San Francisco, where there was one, or in California there was one in Sydney too. It does nothing for international relations. So actually, at this time, it was proposed, and then they were all ready to come down. I don't know what possessed them to think that the Singapore, ministries would approve such an idea. But they're all ready to come down. And one of my colleagues, who was a PhD student in Japanese Studies Department, Yusuke Watanabe, he was all ready to do the first comfort tour of Singapore, comfort woman tour in Singapore, because they wanted to know all the places, and he'd picked them all out using Professor Hayashi's work. And he said he went to the place where he was supposed to meet them, and there was no one there. So they're all, but mostly they were put off by the whole thing, actually. So yes, it is an interesting footnote to Kim Bok Dong. Okay, so also that same Japanese scholar, actually, who was working in the Japanese Studies Department, he co-wrote this book with Professor Takashima, and it's basically a kind of leftist tour of Singapore for Japanese tourists, because it has the Jalan Kirchhoff site. It has a good picture of that. And it is used. I met one person who was, once again, an NUS PhD student who was from Japan. She actually was using that book, and she used that book to find the comfort station at Jalan Jurong Kirchhoff as well. And also there's the one in Book of Paseo is mentioned. So these products of historical research are appearing in various ways. And I can't predict a kind of comfort woman tour of Singapore as a feature of tours or heritage tours or dark heritage, but there is that interest certainly amongst Koreans and Japanese. So lastly, I'll just go to this, which is the end. So thank you very much for your attendance, and
Hi, my name is Nisha. I'm a writer and NTU PhD student. I've got two questions. First, I'm curious about the other roles played by Japanese women in Singapore during the occupation, besides serving in these stations and restaurants. Second, I'm doing research into Singapore's LGBT history, and I recently read a short story by Goh Sin Tub written in the 1980s, it's a fiction piece, but he describes a teacher whom he respects very much having sexual relations with a male student. And I was wondering, given that Japan has traditionally had less of a taboo on homosexuality than European nations, I was wondering if you found any other stories of non-heterosexual liaisons in World War II history.
Japanese women first. Okay. Japanese women did hold a variety of jobs. Actually, there were typists, there were officers. Obviously, they were part of the civilian administration. Okay, they weren't part of the military administration. Singapore had a military administration and a much weaker civilian administration. That was where Shinozaki was welfare officer and also education officer. So he was always on a kind of somewhat losing end, actually. So a lot of the Japanese women were employed in the civilian administration. Some were in also the businesses like Mitsubishi and a few others did employ Japanese women. Okay, so the Japanese women did have more roles than just hostesses or geisha or whatever. Okay. The LGBT issue is quite interesting. There's a book, your literature, so there's an interesting book by, I think, Robert Klein, actually. And he looks at the literature representations of the Japanese occupation in Singapore, Malaysia, and the Philippines. It's published by the University of Philippines. It's at NUS Library, I think. And he finds a gay man who was a comfort woman, actually. He was a transsexual, actually. He didn't have the operation, but he was with a group of people. It's a very fascinating interview because he puts it into this book. There's no reason why this book should have it. It's basically about how Go Sin Tub represents Japanese occupation, how Philippine authors represent, and he has this special interview because he says, I must preserve this for posterity in a sense that at that time there was this man who'd lived with the Japanese occupation, and basically he and a group of friends, they were basically transvestites, female performers or whatever. And then when the Japanese occupation came, they would carry on their kind of trade as well. And then they were caught by the Japanese who thought they were women, and they were beaten up a lot, and they were raped as well. And they continued on as comfort women, gay comfort women, actually. So it's quite a fascinating story. And yeah, it is documented by Klein in that book, actually, on basic literature representation. So
this is in the Philippines.
In the Philippines, in Manila, actually. One time, the group goes to the provinces, and actually they mix with the men who obviously are quite simple and backward in their minds, and they don't realize that these are not men, they're not women, but they're actually men. And then they just go back to Manila again. And basically continue the trade that they're working in. But while they were enslaved by the Japanese, they said the Japanese would regularly rape them, actually. They knew they were men, and they were really, kind of upset. So it's quite an interesting interview, actually, that goes on. I haven't seen anything like that, but that's quite unique, yeah. So, yeah, it's probably, perhaps the only case that we'll ever know of something, similar to what you've asked, yeah. So, yeah, Klein, actually, I can't remember the exact title of the book, actually, but it is about Philip. You can Google the book, actually, in a sense. It's one of the Google books. Yeah. So it's quite an interesting interview, actually. Incredible in terms of an interview. Okay.
Thank you.
I came a bit late, so I didn't get to hear about your book, the title of it. And could you just describe it a bit? That's A. B. There seems to be a kind of a veil over the participation of Singaporean women in these things, and nobody seems to want to whatever. But I'm kind of interested to know, was there, and what are the numbers, not only of the Singapore women, but the whole comfort women population, and just delving into that a bit, please.
Okay. The book about basically war memory and the making of modern Malaysia and Singapore, it covers the comfort women a little, actually, but enough to actually make those Korean historians who are working on the project get in contact with me. The other books I put up actually cover it more. Yeah. My book, actually, it covers a lot more than the comfort women, actually, but it's called War Memory and the Making of Modern Malaysia and Singapore. Okay, so some of the quotes that are put up will be in that book. Okay. But to get to your more interesting question about Singaporean women who are comfort women, yes, that piece of evidence from NI Low actually suggests that there are 16 or 15 comfort women who've come back from Java, so that's 16. And also the Indonesian women who married Malay men and settled down, so that's probably 20 if we go by the figures, because actually the Indonesians the Indonesian Red Cross came to Singapore in the middle of 1946 looking to recover the Indonesian women, actually. And this is when all the details came out because the Red Cross documented all these details. So actually it seemed to be that there were 50 women who were brought to Tanjong Katong Road who were Indonesian women. And of that 50, basically 20 actually were repatriated to Indonesia through the Red Cross, the Indonesian Red Cross. So, there must be 30 who decided to stay. And there were women who decided to stay. And they married men, according to Opham Wok, in Amber Road, Kampong, around there, actually. So, but we don't find, like in Malaysia, actually, we find the experience is larger in numbers in terms of Chinese women who actually just forcibly enslaved or tricked, actually. This is like Kim Bok Dong was tricked, actually. She was going to work in a factory, and then she discovered it wasn't a factory, it was basically a comfort house, and she was 14 years old. So in Malaysia, there was, basically some level of force used, and they mainly focused on Chinese women, as you see with the quotation of used. In Singapore, obviously, the numbers in the comfort stations tend to suggest actually that there's not many Singapore women, because that would come out in the oral history testimony. What comes out is that initially they think they're Japanese and then Indonesians. But in terms of, they also, some say Chinese as well. But there were, it suggests that numbers of Singapore women in Singapore comfort stations are not high if they are present. And whereas in Malaysia, in Malaysia, the numbers of local women are reasonably high, in a sense that there's various directives that are given to various armies, and one of them is use local women as much as possible because we don't want to use Japanese women for the comfort stations. So I would suggest. She was sent everywhere, actually. China, and then Indonesia, Malaysia, and then in the last few days, if you go to the interview on Asian Boss, actually, she discusses her life in October last year. She says that when the surrender came, she was working in Singapore. She had just arrived in Singapore at probably early 45. And then when surrender came, actually, she says actually that the Japanese tried to, pretend that the comfort women were really nurses by setting up these hospitals, or whatever, when they were surrendered. And so she became a nurse, in a sense. But actually, there are other accounts in the press that say that some of these Korean women that were staying too long at Cairnhill Road, actually. So even in those days, actually, if you look at some of the press accounts, there were complaints in October 1945 that what are these Korean women doing in Cairnhill Road? What are they doing in Cairnhill Road? We could get people to occupy those places or whatever. So not much sympathy, actually. Not much sympathy in it sometimes. But there's always been some kind of rumours and kind of stories that there were comfort women in Singapore who perhaps are still alive. But I would imagine by now many of them have taken that secret to their graves, actually. And I think it's to do with patriarchy, in a sense, is that these women were enslaved by patriarchy. The idea, the justification that many of the military had was basically the soldiers are doing the fighting and the women must serve the men. Some of the comfort stations, I think in other places, not in Singapore, had that actually inscribed in Japanese characters, basically that the women are serving the men, who are fighting the war, actually. So, patriarchy, is not that sympathetic to women who are in this position. And you can read it in terms of the press accounts that are appearing in 45, 46. They're complaining about prostitution. They're complaining about all these women who are suddenly appearing who weren't there before, because even if you were poor, you turn to prostitution if it was, basically something that keep you alive and so on. And also some families sold some of their daughters to marriage brokers who actually sold them to the Japanese. So you do get these things that are popping up after, in 45, 46, which suggest that perhaps there are more Singapore women who actually are comfort women than what we would imagine today, actually. Yeah. But we don't know. Okay, well, that's a good question. Thanks very much. Okay.
Thank you, and I think this gentleman here.
Okay. All right.
Hello, my name is Subaya. I think you partly covered my question already, but I'll just still ask it. It seems like, there were no or very few Singapore women in Singapore, in the comfort houses, but they were sent to other places. And then there were Indonesians coming here. And the lady Kim seems to have moved around a lot. So I'm just wondering whether, was there a policy that not to use the local women in their hometowns, but to send them somewhere else? And at a higher level, how was this organized? I mean, at a local level, we can see how the battalions were organizing this, but was it something at the highest level of the army that, just like a logistics department, you have a department for this, handling all of this? Yeah.
Okay. Yes, it's interesting actually. The comfort women is kind of like what we call transnational history in a sense. Perhaps this is why it's never really resonated in Singapore histories, because you see a lot of Korean women coming, you see a lot of Indonesian women coming, even the Chinese women coming seem to be coming from China actually. So yeah, that's the issue that pops up actually, is that because it's kind of transnational. This movement of women around. Of course, the dominant group is Korean women, and you find Korean women in many of these places, actually. Indonesian women, in the 1990s, the comfort women issue sparked off more protest in Indonesia and the Philippines than other Southeast Asian countries. Of course, basically all countries had comfort women. There were Thai women who were basically turned into comfort women as too. But Indonesia and the Philippines seem to have large numbers. In terms of sending them overseas, there's no real accounts of Philippine women being sent elsewhere. Indonesian women being sent, certainly to Singapore, maybe to Malaysia as well. It depended actually. In Malaysia's case, if I was talking to you about Malaysia right now, it would be such a different scenario really, because they used local women a lot, particularly Chinese women, because they had basically the antagonism towards the Chinese. That's one of the the reasons given in the literature. So moving women around, like they move labour around. Like interestingly, when they moved Indonesian labourers to the Burma-Thailand Railway, they would basically move them with the women. The women didn't know. The women thought they were going to become nurses or whatever, and the men had some idea they were going to become labourers. So on the same ship as the labourers going to the Burma-Thailand Railway were these women, because the Japanese moved labour around all throughout their empire. So it's no real surprise that they moved these women around, actually. So in Indonesia, a lot of comfort stations were staffed by Indonesian women, and also they put pressure on the civilian internees, the Dutch women and some British women actually, to also become comfort women for the Japanese too. These are well documented because they were actually, very literate women actually who could write their stories down, and there were war crimes trials in Indonesia about this actually. So it is something that is interesting that you raise, this transnational nature of the comfort women. Okay.
Right. So I think we're running out of time, so we would have time for maybe one last or two questions. We'll start with the lady here. This one here. Okay.
Thanks, Professor. Two quick questions. My name is Josephine. I'm a writer. What is the average age range of the women? I know the 14-year-old. That's the first one. And secondly, how many men did these women have to service each day?
Okay, I'll just be quick about this. The average age, the age that they wanted actually was supposedly 18 to something like 35. When they saw Kim Bok-dong and they knew that she was 14, some of the Japanese officials didn't like that at all, actually. They said, basically, you can't have her, she's only 14. You see a variety of reactions to it, actually. The next question was?
How many men does each girl have?
Yes, actually, when they do the interviews, they always emphasize the high numbers, like, on the Sunday, they service 40 or whatever. The women tend to remember the times when they had those large numbers, but even when they started to do 4 or 5 a day, there are reports about the pain of, just because many of them were young girls, like 14, 16, or actually they're supposed to only take, basically 16, 18 to about 35. So, the women will describe these type of, horrible situations, and usually they'll emphasize the times when they really had to serve a lot of men. If each man is given 30 minutes, obviously 40, 50 is not likely, but obviously they served a lot of men, actually. There's no doubt about that, usually they'll give quite high figures, which are probably accurate, actually, because, basically these men would have, basically a Sunday or whatever with them, which was quite busy. Other times, 4 to 5 is when they would start. Okay. The next question.
Right, so I think we have one last question from the gentleman over there.
Thanks. I'm Fabian, a counsel. I just 2 questions very quickly. How did the word comfort woman come about? It sounds like a horrible euphemism. Is it from the Japanese, or how did it come to pass? And more importantly, why are they mostly Koreans? If it's because they could speak Japanese, Taiwan was also colonized for more than 40 years. So why, is it revenge on the Korean resistance?
Okay, comfort women, we find actually these houses sometimes are called relaxation houses as well. It is a euphemism, of course. Historians really are not, they don't want to use comfort women actually, because that the organizations that are set up in Korea, they don't use comfort women, they use sexually enslaved women, okay? But because it's so common in the currency and so many people have heard of it, historians will use comfort women. It is a euphemism. They did use it actually. They did use it. There's no doubt about that. These houses are sometimes called relaxation houses as well, even though they're basically, as we see, basically houses of sexual enslavement. Okay. Your next question was about Koreans. Okay. Obviously, Korea was a place where they'd colonized it for a very long time. Okay, they did use local women, Chinese women a lot actually, but Koreans they used them extensively. Why Korean women? It could well be that because they'd colonized Korea for such a long time and they had all these kind of networks to basically get Korean women into basically the military. They would coerce them, they'd trick them. Perhaps it was easier or whatever, and they would serve also perhaps in China, maybe sometimes in Japan actually as well. I think it's because of the colonial relationship between the two, and perhaps as you say, it might be that they could speak Japanese easier, but the nature of the work didn't require language as a major kind of category. So they used a lot of Chinese women, and I think over the next 10 years, as China starts to ramp up its kind of memory war with the Japanese government, I think you'll see a lot of Chinese comfort women coming out and places that are preserved. Yes, it's a Japanese expression for this. The Korean women themselves today call themselves women who are sexually enslaved by the military. Actually, that their association is called that. They don't actually use it, but because it's such common currency, as historians we tend to use it rather than just those 3 words. But it's from the Japanese military actually.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. Blackburn. So that sums up our first talk in the Historia SG series for this year. Thank you very much. And before you leave, can I please trouble you to fill out our feedback form? So you can either do it digitally, or I think you've been given the hard copy. And for the hard copies, you can just pass them to my colleagues while you're on the way out. And secondly, don't worry if you've missed any part of the lecture, because as I mentioned earlier, the talk will be uploaded as a video on the museum's website. So do look out for that. I think it should be happening sometime in March. So thank you very much once again, and have a good evening.